So, as some of you know, if you've been listening to the program regularly, I began to work through a book by Robert Koons, which is called A Lutheran's Case for Roman Catholicism, Finding a Lost Path Home, by Robert C. Koons, who left the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod and joined the Roman Catholic Communion. So Robert Koons, supposedly, I've heard that he's going to be doing some kind of discussion or something like that on some of the material that I put out on his work. So I wanted to continue this. I did two programs. The first was on justification, going through some of the material there, and then I went through his argument against sola scriptura. And I said before that I wanted to do more on the doctrine of justification as he explains it and give a defense of the Lutheran view. So initially, as I was setting up this program and thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, I wanted to go back and look at, just continue his argument and look at essentially the question of what are the works of the law that Paul is talking about, and is he excluding any works whatsoever or just ceremonial works? And that is really key for not just the Roman Catholic position, but that's also key in Pauline scholarship today and a lot of debates with the new perspective on Paul and other things. But as I was working my way through this and thinking through some of the things that I wanted to talk about there, I realized that there was something else that I felt like was a little more foundational to get out of the way before we got into the details of that. And that is, what exactly is the Roman view of justification? Because this is something that I find a lot in discussions about justification today with Roman Catholics, and especially those who are converting to Roman Catholicism that I've spoken with, and people that I know that are listeners to my podcast or friends or whatever who have joined the Roman Church and think that there's a problem with the Lutheran understanding of justification, is when they've wrestled through these questions, they have heard answers from a lot of Roman apologists and contemporary theologians that resonate with the Pauline text in some ways, but I would argue are not really consistent with where Rome was historically. And the idea is this: when you're talking to a lot of contemporary Roman Catholics and those who have joined the church, oftentimes when you discuss particular texts about justification by faith, you'll find in discussion that people will grant that there is justification by faith alone. However, that's initial justification. Until they'll say, yeah, you're right, that there is justification by faith alone, but that's just initial justification, and there's a final justification by works, and there's the process of justification that follows that initial justification, if you want to use that terminology. And what that does is it allows the Roman Catholic to grab onto like any major text, both biblical and patristic, that is going to be used to bolster the argument for the Lutheran position. And they're going to say, hey, this fits in the Roman system too, so it's not an argument for your position because, hey, we too believe this. It's just initial justification, not final justification, not this ongoing justification. It's something else. So that means that when I grab onto a quote from Ambrose, or I grab onto a quote from First Clement, or from John Chrysostom that say things like, pretty clearly articulate some form of a justification that is by faith without works, and not just Jewish ceremonial works, but works whatsoever. And I say, hey, this sounds a lot like what Luther's saying. This sounds a lot like what Chemnitz is saying, or what Gerhard is saying, or what's outlined in the Book of Concord. This doesn't really seem to fit with the position of Trent. The response that I often get from Roman Catholics is, oh, that fits perfectly fine. So they grab onto, because that distinction between initial justification by faith alone and then a final justification that is by works allows them to really say anything fits our system. So like any statement in the Fathers that goes either direction, they can say, well, we can fit both of those in our system because we've got this justification and this justification. So our system is the most consistent with the Fathers, and our system is the most consistent with Scripture because we know how to deal with all of the text then. And what this ends up with in kind of just practical conversation is something that seems to be really similar to where the Reformed Church went on justification in some ways. And, I think if you look at someone like, Mark Jones and his book on antinomianism, how he outlines justification and the role of works in the final judgment, or if you look at some of the statements of John Piper or others, it appears to be pretty similar to what the Roman Catholics are saying from that perspective. If there really is this kind of initial justification by faith that can even be said to be faith alone, and then there's this other justification that's ongoing, or final justification that's different, that's not faith alone. At that point, the question is like, what's the difference between Rome and the Reformed position, say? So maybe there really isn't that much of a difference. And, this is something that, as I have spent some time reading, the Council of Trent, right, the decrees of the canons of Trent, and as I've spent plenty of time reading Gerhard and Chemnitz and others that are interacting with the Roman Catholic position, and then looked at people like Bellarmine and what they're articulating, Bellarmine being the kind of foremost polemicist in favor of Rome. So if you want to, if you want to see like the best arguments for Rome, Bellarmine is known for having the best arguments. So if you look at someone like Gerhard, or if you look at the Reformed scholastics as well, getting into the 17th century, everyone interacts with Bellarmine because it's understood. Bellarmine was brilliant. He knew his church history very well. If there are good arguments for Rome, he had the best that there were. So everyone interacts with Bellarmine. They understand the importance of his writing. And what I've noticed is that the arguments that people like Gerhard and the Reformed scholastics as well, so the Lutheran and Reformed scholastics make on justification, are opposing a position that is not exactly the position that is articulated by a lot of modern Roman Catholic apologists on justification. Because it was very clearly understood in the 17th century that there's no justification by faith alone. There's no initial justification by faith alone. That's not the Roman position. And it wasn't the Roman position at Trent. It is a way to address the challenges that the Reformation has posed to Trent so that contemporary Roman Catholics can grab onto this idea of this initial justification by faith alone as a way to say, hey, see, we believe this too. And now our system kind of fits anything you want to throw at it. And this is a problem with and I've said this before, this is a problem in my mind with the Roman system and the way that it develops. It formulates categories in such a way that it becomes impervious to critique, right? So if, you point out, all of the statements against praying to anything other than God, as I pointed out, people like Origen, this is pretty clearly stated in some of the earliest fathers. We're talking about the issue of prayer to the saints. Well, they say, well, no, there's one kind of prayer and there's another kind of prayer. There's one kind of there's worship and then there's veneration. There's, if you talk about the Mass and the sacrifice of Christ, well, no, those statements are just against a literal re-sacrifice, but we're talking about a representation of the sacrifice. That's something different. And so the difficulty in challenging Rome, especially when you're going to the Church Fathers and you're going to Scripture, is if you make enough distinctions ideologically and theologically, what you're doing is making so many distinctions that the position becomes unchallengeable, really, because you've argued your way a way that you are now consistent with the text by making a particular distinction that maybe wasn't there before. And so instead of saying, hey, no, the text actually fits our view, then you say, well, actually our view is, and then make a further distinction so that it can't be kind of toppled by those arguments. And it appears that something similar is happening with the doctrine of justification, because it's pretty clear when you read Bellarmine, when you read the canons of Trent, that they have an understanding that there is no justification by faith alone. Like there just isn't. And that's not how they're expressing justification. Another issue that's going to come up is the question of assurance. This also changes very drastically. In the polemics, both in Luther's own lifetime and following Luther, it's very clear that the Roman Catholic Church, post-Trent, takes the position that one cannot have assurance that they are in a state of grace. There is no assurance that you are in a state of grace. And that's stated all over the place. Now, today, when I look at the way that Roman apologists particularly express themselves, they do speak about, yeah, of course you can have assurance that you're in a state of grace. Like you go to confession, you participate in the sacramental life of the church, yes, you're in a state of grace. What we're really talking about is you don't have any, when we say that you can't have assurance, you don't have any absolute assurance that you're going to persevere to the end. Of course, you can't have that kind of 100% absolute assurance. And okay, well, that sounds much more reasonable, because technically, does any of us know with 100% assurance that we're going to persevere to the end? Well, I don't know. So they say, look, so we're not really that different from you, right? So you even see this in the critiques that I've looked at from SSPX. At some of these SSPX priests dealing with the Reformation, is they criticize specifically the Reformed Church for their view of kind of looking inward for assurance. And they say, oh, that's a horrible place to put yourself in, to say that you can't have any assurance. And what they end up doing is basically coming to a Lutheran conclusion and giving a Lutheran answer to these questions, which I find funny. But which I'm glad like they do. And I'm not saying that, I wish Rome would go back to what Trent taught. But what I'm trying to demonstrate is just that there is not consistency between what you hear today and what was taught officially by the church at the Council of Trent in response to the Reformation. So it was the Tridentine view that you cannot have assurance that you're in a state of grace. It's not the Tridentine view that you can have assurance that you're in a state of grace. It's just that you can't, unless you have a supernatural revelation, of course, you can't know that you're going to be finally saved. But generally, you can know, that you're in a state of grace now if you're repentant and things like that. That's not the Roman view. It was not the Roman view. And what you see is there's just this ever-shifting perspective in Rome, which takes away the appeal of this consistency of the church. It just simply isn't there. And I think that's demonstrable in so many ways. And of course, you come up with excuses for that too, because all of a sudden, even though Trent is very clear that there is, that it is the belief of the Council of Trent that what is taught at Trent is the unanimous consensus of the fathers. It's not. It's demonstrably not. So what happens is Newman develops the development hypothesis that now the church is impervious to any historical argument against it, because it just says, well, that doctrine just didn't develop yet, because now you have the development hypothesis. They're the seeds of the doctrine. So what Rome has done is, as I've said, it makes itself impervious to any critique because of the categories that it creates. That's why you can look at Chemnitz's entire 4-volume examination of the Council of Trent, where he demonstrates so much inconsistency between Trent and the fathers of the church. And then Kuhns can just, in like a couple sentences, be like, oh, hey, but there's this whole development of doctrine thing, so it doesn't matter. This is what's so frustrating with dealing with these things. So what I want to do now is just jump into the canons of Trent and read them. If anyone says, Canon 30, that after the reception of the grace of justification, the guilt is so remitted, and the debt of eternal punishment so blotted out, that no debt of temporal punishment remains to be discharged before the gates of heaven can be opened, let him be anathema. And that is really dealing with the question of purgatory. Now, we can expand upon that a little bit too, because are you saying that, what do you mean that there are no temporal punishments? Are you saying that there are no temporal consequences of sins? Because that's just not true. And the Lutheran confessions do deal with this. The Apology of the Augsburg Confession especially deals with this. So it is true that there are temporal consequences to sins, but does God have to punish us? Does he have to punish us in order for us to obtain the grace of being in his presence, the beatific vision? Do we have to suffer some kind of temporal punishment, whether it's purgatory or something else, in order to get there? That is simply not a biblical conception at all. So, and I would argue that it's not a patristic one either. But again, I could point that out and show that it's not a patristic conception, but then you just, say, hey, development hypothesis, so it doesn't matter anyway.